So thank you everyone for joining online. This is another one of our sessions in the Industry Career Series that Brad Fackler runs. So yes, we're excited to hear from Brad again today.
Thank you, Emily. This program is the Organization of Business, and this program grew out of questions that I would get from fellows who returned from interviews. And they would ask about a certain department or a certain position or a term that may be commonly used in industry. And so what we've done is put this program together that will introduce you to positions, departments, and terminology, particularly to those outside of the areas of R&D. Now, before we get into the program, as you know, I often do, I show some of the industry metrics. And we've in the past looked at hiring and layoffs, and we'll take a look at those. But there's some now financial metrics that I've begun to trace that give you a sense of how the industry is doing. So first, we'll look at the postings. This is as of the end of the third quarter of last year. I won't get the fourth quarter figures until next month. But you see there, it will require a little explanation because when you look at it, you look at and you say, ooh, hiring isn't so good. And that's not exactly the case. What you see in 2024 is in comparison to 21 and 22, yes, it is lower. But in 21 and 22, we were in a hyper hiring environment. So we are down to where we were back about 2019. And significant in that is that 2019 was the highest hiring to date at that time. So you see that it's a pretty good hiring market out there. Now, one confounding factor that we've begun to trace is our companies that are announcing layoffs. This looks at a quarterly look at them since 2022, and it's kind of a good news, bad news story. You see these are, you see quite a few of these companies that are announcing layoffs, but the good news is that the projection when we see the fourth quarter of 24, it's projected that will be lower than 23. So at least a good data point there. The other thing that is good news in there, if you will, is that there's really no consistent rationale or reason that companies are doing this. So when they announce these layoffs, it is because of company-specific issues. Now look at some of the financial things that we began to track as well. This is the venture capital rounds. So it looks at between 2022 and 2024. You're seeing an increasing amount of venture capital rounds, both in the number of rounds and in the amount, and that's a little over $15 billion that they are that we're looking at there. This is particularly important for new companies and startups, their ability to raise money. And kind of on the heels of that, we look at IPOs, initial public offerings, and these two tend to follow each other. The IPOs tend to follow after the venture capital rounds. So again, you're seeing not the kind of numbers that we were seeing in 21 and 22, but again, you're seeing this that we're getting, that we are picking up IPOs. And finally, we'll look at the mergers and acquisitions. This is kind of a good news, bad news story as well. The good news is you're seeing about $46 billion in mergers and acquisitions in 2024. That is down somewhat from 2023, and it is lower than what the projection is. Now, the good news here is that this year, 2025, is off to a good start because there have been several acquisitions announced at the JP Morgan conference, which is going on this week in San Francisco. So with that, let's get into the program. First, let's look at how do you read a job ad? You're attending this program probably because you're thinking about an industry position. How do you read these job ads? And so most importantly, it is important to look at the job responsibilities. And if those job responsibilities match what your experience is, this is a job that you should think about applying to. Now, the one thing that I always point out here is never, never, ever look at the position name and where it reports in the organization, because that sometimes can be misleading. First of all, from the position name, and you'll see as we go through this program, there's not a lot of consistency on how different companies describe the different positions. And if you look at this one that's up there and you say, oh, this is way too high for me, I couldn't report to a senior vice president of regulatory and chief compliance officer. Don't think about that, because this could be a small company. There may be only 20 people in the company, and there may be 4 senior vice presidents. So don't pay attention to that. Try to match the job responsibilities with your experience. So now to this program. What we want to try to do is provide you with some basic understanding of company structures, position titles, and terminologies to facilitate conversations with industry people prior to and during your interview. We'll approach it this way. We'll look at what are the critical functions of a business and how do companies organize themselves to perform those functions. And then we'll look at jobs and titles within R&D, and we'll look at key tools, business terms used in company areas beyond R&D. And it's when we get to that point that I'm going to be asking questions and put you guys on the spot. So let's look at this. In order to succeed, a business has to do 4 things. They have to be able to create their product. They have to be able to make their product. And they have to be able to sell their product. And they have to be able to account for the cash coming in and the cash going out. And what's key here is that this is for every business. This is for the neighborhood lemonade stand that you may have set up as a kid. You had to think up what you were going to sell. Is it pink lemonade? Is it regular lemonade? Oh, maybe it's iced tea. Then you have to make it. You have to get in your mom's cabinet, stir up everything, and get it all set. And you have to sell it. You have to put it on the table and find the best place where you're going to be able to draw people to come in. And then you have to account for the cash coming in. That might be the old cigar box where you put the cash in. And if you're a good negotiator and you've negotiated with your mom, she may not charge you for the actual lemonade mix. And so that happens in that lemonade stand. That happens in companies like General Motors, like Apple. And so they all have to do those 4 things. Now when we look at those, we give them fancier names. Okay, we call the creating it, we call that research and development. Making the product, we call that operations. Selling the product is commercial. And accounting for the cash is finance. And what's interesting here, if you think about different companies and different industries, a different one of those is the most critical element. So for example, in our business, the business of science, it's research and development. In order to be successful, companies have to continue coming up with new and improved products. If you look at other industries, other areas may have a different area that is critical. In the banking industry, the obvious one is finance. If they're able to have better technology around their financial tools, that is competitive advantage. In the, if you look at commercial, think of consumer products. Those are driven on advertising and commercial value. And finally, operations, think of the automobile industry. If companies can come up with ways to manufacture better quality cars, they have an advantage. Or if they can manufacture cars that are that are the same quality but can do it less or more efficiently and less expensively, that is competitive advantage. So now when we look at these 4 areas, we put these and we expand them. And we're going to be thinking more about the science industries here. Research and development, that includes research, which is the product discovery, the development, preparing that product for the market, and regulatory, which is concerned with product approval. In operations, that's manufacturing and quality assurance. The commercial is marketing, it's sales, and it's business development. And that is product acquisition. That is generally for larger companies acquiring products, and product divestitures, smaller companies out licensing or divesting their products. And then finance and administration. That's the accounting, which is revenue and payment. Finance, which is the fiscal planning. And generally the administrative functions are put in here: HR, IT, and legal. So now companies have to organize these. And we look at a functional organization here where we have each of the areas reporting into the executive management. So here we have thinking up the products, preparing them for the market, getting them approved, operation, manufacturing and quality assurance, commercial, product strategy, promotion, acquisition, and the finance, sales, accounting, payment obligations, compensation, HR, legal, and IT. Now there's several ways you can do that. A flat organization, and that is where you have all of these functions reporting into an executive management or an executive management team. Now this kind of organization you would see in smaller companies where they may not have each one of those functions. So it is it can be a one person can effectively manage those. As the companies may grow, you may get a hierarchical organization where you have the basic functions such as research, development, and regulatory reporting into an R&D head who then reports to management. And you can see how each of those might do that. Now, there are advantages to this functional organization, and that is that it promotes functional effectiveness and efficiency, and it encourages effective supervisor and subordinate relationship. There are some disadvantages in this, and that is it inhibits cross-functional communication and collaboration, and it can result in functional power centers or fiefdoms. So an alternate organization would be a matrix organization where you might have certain of these functions reporting into 2 bosses or 2 areas. In the example I'm showing here, it shows regulatory and quality assurance, which are important both for R&D and for the manufacturing portion, that they may be actually reporting into both of those areas. Another rather common one would be the business development function, because business development, you may acquire products or divest products in R&D, or you may divest and acquire products that are commercially available. And so that function could well form or report into two different functions. And another common way to do that is sometimes companies will put their administrative functions, HR, legal, IT, and will break those up and have smaller groups specializing in each of these functions. So in this one, there are some advantages to this. It promotes cross-functional collaboration, and it supports effective project management initiatives. But like the other one, there are disadvantages, and it can create functional inefficiencies and result in difficulty in individual performance management. So let's look at some job titles. In this executive function, you may have a chief executive officer. You may have a president. You may have, in the science area, you may have a chief scientific officer or a vice president of R&D. In the operations, you might have a vice president of operations. Commercial, you might have a chief commercial officer or a vice president of marketing and sales. And in the finance, you might have a chief financial officer or a vice president of finance. Now, you'll notice that each of the three, science, commercial, and finance, have a chief officer of that area, but in the operations, there isn't any. And that's because that product or that title generally is reserved for a special, a different kind of a job. And I should say, you would get each of the VPs of the areas that report into each of those. Now, the chief operating officer is a different position. And that may be an organization that looks like this. You'll have a chief operating officer reporting to the chief executive officer. And then the marketing and sales, the manufacturing, and the R&D report into that chief operating officer. And normally, even in this case, the chief financial officer will report to the chief executive. This is a kind of structure that companies use a lot of times in young companies where the chief executive officer is really out trying to get financial backing and investment. And so the chief operating officer runs the business while that person is doing that job. So now let's look at the R&D functions. We have the chief scientific officer, and reporting into them is that person is a vice president of research, a vice president of preclinical development, and a vice president of clinical development. And under there, in the research area, you see the roles and responsibilities: conducting discovery research and team participation and management, the career tracks, target identification, validation, assay development, and new chemical entities. And in the preclinical development, you see similar kinds of things: drug characterization, evaluating and selecting the most promising ones, and conducting preclinical studies. The career tracks, metabolism and pharmacokinetics, tox, pharmacology, translational research, and medicine. Now, those two areas that we just talked about, research and preclinical development, those are the most direct ways for your experience to translate into the industry. You may have noticed when we went through the roles and responsibilities and thought, hey, I do some of that. And so that's really the most direct way to get into industry. When we look at the clinical development, the roles and responsibilities are a little bit different. And it's design and monitor clinical trials, trial oversight, and data verification. And the career tracks are in program management and clinical research associates and coordinators. Now, we look at the job titles. Oftentimes, reporting into a vice president of research will be a director and then a manager of each of the labs. And here are the job titles. Now, remember, we said before, there's not a lot of consistency in how companies do that. So you may see positions like this that you may qualify for in moving into industry. In the preclinical development, you might see the same kind of thing, a director over multiple labs, and then each lab has a manager with the personnel in the lab that could be one of those 5 titles. And we said as clinical development is a little bit different, the job titles here are a little different too. You might have a director, and then you'll see medical monitor, program manager, clinical research, scientist, clinical research associate, contract administrator. So those are a little bit different. So there is one other area that we'll try to talk about, and that is an area which is above the CEO, and that's the board of directors. It's made up of 3 to 15 business executives. A small company may have 3. General Motors has 15. And there are 2 types. There are independent or external directors, and they are not part of the company management. And then there are internal directors, and they are part of company management, and that's normally a CEO and or the CFO. And their role is in oversight of proper financial and reporting responsibilities. We'll look at the difference here in a little while about of public companies and private companies, but the role of the board of directors is much more important / difficult in a public company because the financial reporting requirements are so much more stringent. So let's look at some key terms. And here's where we want you to get ready, because you're going to have to answer some of these things. And you'll be glad to know that when you do answer these, I am authorized at the end of this program to award you an MBA, because we are talking about the business now, not the science. So let's look at operations and what some of the terms are. And again, you can either just unmute yourself and yell it out or put it in the chat. First one is an SOP. What's an SOP? We start with the easy ones.
Standard operating procedures.
There it
There we
is.
go.
Okay, we're on our way to this new degree. All right. How about GLP? Anybody know what GLP stands for?
Good lab practices from a couple people.
There we go. Good laboratory practices, which is a system of controls for research that ensures uniformity, consistency, and reproducibility. Now, does anybody know who defines what GLP is? Okay, this is a tough one. Wait a minute.
No response.
Okay, it's an organization called CLIA, the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. And that is who defines the rules and regulations around good laboratory practices. How about GMP?
Good manufacturing practices.
There we go. Look at that. You guys are getting hot now, warming up. Okay, good manufacturing processes. And I'm going to ask, who defines good manufacturing practices?
No takers on
Yeah,
this?
okay, no takers. Okay, good manufacturing practices are defined by the FDA.
Ah, there we go. Yep, FDA.
Okay. How about SKU?
Stock keeping unit.
That is it. Look at that. Stock keeping unit, or sometimes called a shelf keeping unit. And by the way, when you go to the grocery store and you scan your products in, you're scanning in the SKU. And a pilot plant. Anybody know what a pilot plant is? It's a plant that manufactures pilots. No, that's not it.
You do not make pilots.
Okay. All right. This is a facility that is established to manufacture limited quantities of a product, generally for clinical trial usage. All right. Now let's look at some finance and board of directors. First of all, I think it's important, let's look at some of the reports that companies use for finance, and then we'll talk about some key terms. So although the finance people have hundreds of different kinds of reports, there's really four basic ones that a company needs to use. And the first is the balance sheet. And that presents the company's financial position at any given time. And it consists of three components: the company's assets, so what the company owns, the liabilities, what the company owes, and the rest of that would be referred to as the stockholders' equity or the book value of the company. Now, those of you that may have had a business course or an economic course know that assets equals liabilities plus shareholder equity. Right? So it's called a balance sheet because those three elements have to balance. As the example, you see total assets of 2.1 million, and then you have the equity and liabilities, and the total is 2.1. The next financial report is the income statement. And this is important because this shows the profitability of a company, or how the profits of the company are changing over a given period of time. And it contains revenues, so revenues from the primary company activities, revenues from any other sources, and then gains from non-business activities, such as a sale of real estate or something like that, and expenses. So expenses and losses, secondary activities, primary activities, and then losses on sale of long-term goods or something like that. And so if that net income figure at the bottom is positive, then the company is making money. If it is negative, the companies are losing money for a particular period of time. Then you have the cash flow statement, and this reports cash generated during the time interval specified. So of the revenues that are gained, how much of that is in cash? And so you'll see from operating activities, from investment activities, or from other finance activities. So how much of that is in cash? And finally, you have the statement of shareholder equity. So remember from the formula we had before, the equity is the assets minus the liabilities. And the shareholder equity in a corporation is equal to the owner's equity in a sole proprietorship company. So what is the value of the company once you have the pluses and you take away the minuses? If it's positive, then you have the shareholder equity. Now, I've tried to show how these may fit together. And so we have time period one, we have the beginning balance sheet. And we'll call the time period a quarter. So a quarter of the year where they would look at that. And you would see the statement of cash flow, the statement of shareholder equity, and the income statement, which would be how are these things, cash, revenues, and expenses, changing over that quarter. And that net income figure then is figured into the shareholder equity, and it's called retained earnings. And then these two reports, the shareholder equity and the cash flow, go into the balance sheet for period 2. And again, if that's positive, then the company is making money for the period. If it is negative, the company is losing money for the period. So now we have, so get ready now. We have some terms. What's gross income? And wait here.
Give them all a minute.
Well,
Have just total income, annual income.
yep, that's the total. That's everything. Everything that you earn before you subtract out any of the expenses. Now, how about the gross profit? Ooh, I hit the button too soon. Okay, you get a freebie. So this is the gross receipts less the product costs, but before you take out other costs such as rent, salaries, and things like that. Okay, now we have net profit. And that's where you take everything out. So you take all the costs away, and this is what your net profit is. Your revenues minus all the costs to generate those revenues. So what are revenues? No takers? Oh, you guys aren't salespeople.
Nope,
All
we're
right, 'cause
scientists.
salespeople know revenues there, okay? And that's income realized from the sale of companies' goods. All right, so that's the sales of your products. All right, and this is a real financial term here, EBIT. Anybody know what that is? You guys spent all your time in science classes. You never took any finance courses, did you?
I certainly didn't.
Yeah. All right. EBIT it's called earnings before interest and taxes. And what it is a measure of how you can compare companies across different industries, capital structures, tax rates, and things like that. So it tries to take out all of those variables as a way of comparing companies so you can tell which company is doing better than other companies. Okay, now we have more. Anybody know what COGS is?
Nope, no tickets on this one either.
Okay, nobody know. Okay, this is the direct costs attributable to the manufacturing of the product. It's called cost of goods sold. So what are the costs involved in manufacturing those products? Anybody know what GAAP is? Yeah, I even do that. Okay, it's called generally accepted accounting principles. So this is like the GLP, GMP for the accounting. This is the rules by which companies need to report their financials. Right. And I should say, this is in the United States. There are some differences in how global companies report, but this is a US measure. All right. We'll do public company and private company. Anybody know what's the difference?
This one, some people might know.
Yeah.
Mhm. Type, for public, the stock can be bought by anyone. The public companies have stock.
Yep, that is right. Whose shares are traded freely on one of the global stock exchanges. Absolutely right. How about a private company?
Another person says public company is shares on the market that can be bought by people. Yes.
Yep,
Mhm.
yep. And a private company is one who has sole ownership by an individual or a group of individuals. Right? So private companies are not subject to the strict Security Exchange Commission rules of reporting as the public company. We said that when we talked about the board of directors. That is what is. And so although there are some very big private companies, in general, the public companies are larger and the private companies are smaller. So now commercial. Now we're getting into my area here. Okay, so anybody know what brand identity is? Okay. Not marketers then either.
We're not marketers,
Yeah,
no.
okay.
Still scientists.
The brand identity is the outward expression of a product, including communication style, logo, and that kind of thing. Okay. So think of the big smile for Amazon with the arrow on it. Okay. Brand identity. When you look at it, you think of that company.
Yep, we have one comment. It's what sets the company apart from the rest.
Okay, there you go. Yep. Yep. Now, how about the brand image? Okay, different from the identity, brand image.
The logo. So one person said,
Okay.
the perception of the company.
There we go. There we go. The impression of a product or a company held by consumers. Okay. So for example, when I say, okay, get ready to type, when I say safety, what car company comes to mind?
Subaru.
Oh, good. Yep. Yep. I like that. It used to be Volvo.
Yep.
But
Subaru's the new one.
But Subaru has kind of honed in on the Volvo image. All right. But that's what you think of as brand image. How about market share?
The culture of brand identity.
No,
Not quite.
no. Okay. If you're a marketer, market share is very important. Okay. And that's the portion of the market that is controlled by a particular company or a particular product. All right. Now, in many industries, companies or products might control up to 25 or 30% of the market. Right? In the pharmaceutical industry, the top market share in the company is somewhere around 5 to 6%. And how about share of voice? Share of voice is really important in commodity products.
One person says the portion of mentions by people and brands.
There you go. There you go. Okay. the percentage of advertising activities, and it's usually measured by dollars, of one brand within the total activity of the entire market. All right. And if you think of that, I always think of beer commercials.
Like how
Because-
visible are they?
Yep. And when you see one beer commercial, it is almost certain that within about 20 minutes, you're going to see another one. And that's because in these commodity products like that, you have to maintain a certain level of share of voice, or your voice is not heard at all. And three more for commercial. What is segmentation?
These three are probably harder.
And segmentation is separating the market into groups where within the group they are very similar, and and each group is very different from the other. All right. And this is important to advertisers because that determines where do you put your advertising dollars, which segment of the market. Okay. And how about targeting then?
Aiming ads for just one segment.
There you go. That's exactly right. Yep. You decide which segments are the most attractive and you push your advertising toward that. And how about positioning? You guys are redeeming yourself now on these.
Yes.
All right, positioning is the strategy to make the brand occupy a distinct position. It's defining your brand in the terms of those things that are valued by the customers within those segments. Okay. And some resources to keep in mind. The books, Career Opportunities in Biotech and Drug Development by Friedman. That's my favorite for those of you that may be interested in looking at jobs in industry. Attend some of our segments, and it'd be nice if you would come and do that in person so I can actually look at people and talk to them. The OIT Careers blog, and there's a whole variety of industry-focused articles, and certainly make a virtual appointment with me or one of the other career counselors to discuss what your options may be. So now, I said, if we get through those answers, I can award an MBA. And so there you have it. The MBA is Mastery of Brad's Answers. So thank you, particularly those that chimed in and took a chance on answering those. At this point, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Only the finest of degrees. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. If you've heard any lingo on job interviews that you didn't know what that meant, feel free to bring that up as well. Give you all a couple minutes, type in any questions. Here we go. Carolina asks, for people lined up to pursue a career in R&D, how feasible is it to switch to finance? At what point in your career journey is that most doable?
Oh, and that's a really good question. And the first answer is it is entirely doable. All right. I have seen people who come up through R&D end up in the commercial area. They have ended up in finance. They have ended up in manufacturing. And one of the things we're seeing now is that as we move to more cell and gene therapy products, manufacturing is becoming much more scientific. And so that is a switch that's very common. And there really isn't an answer to when does that become most feasible. That depends on what you want to do. It depends on the company and the operation of the company. Many companies, particularly in this industry, pride themselves on promoting people from within their organization. And so companies like that, those kinds of transitions are entirely doable.
A good follow-up question. Is that transition mostly seen in smaller businesses or in the big companies like J&J, Bayer, et cetera?
It's across the board.
Yep.
Okay. It probably would occur earlier in a smaller company,
Yes.
but I don't think it's any more likely to occur than it is in a big company.
Yeah, especially in small companies when they're just starting up, the roles are very flexible within those companies. So one person may be doing multiple jobs. So lots of opportunities to learn multiple skills in small companies. Yeah, absolutely. That transition can happen at any time. Ooh, okay, here's another one. What's the most common mistake that like PhD scientists make in industry settings? So like how I would interpret this is like in transitioning from what we're doing now as postdocs or fellows here at NIH going into industry, what mistakes may you make?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake that is made in transitioning to industry is overemphasizing your scientific skills and knowledge and underestimating the importance of the softer skills, the teamwork, the communication, things like that. And I think in transition, that's probably the thing that is the biggest surprise to people that are making that transition into industry.
Another follow-up to the transition question we had. So transitioning from say like R&D to finance or similar transitions in what you do, is that feasible after joining a company, or should you get the necessary degrees and training outside and then go to a new position?
Yeah, no, I think you're better off doing it within the company. So a company is most likely to hire you based on your experience in the job responsibilities. So if you try to make that transition before you get into the company, you won't have any experience in that. So it's really get your foot in the door in the company and then talk about moving to other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting your foot in the door is the most important thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
How would you phrase bench research tasks to meet those of other department tasks with metrics of results? STAR methods and CV. Oh, okay. So like, how do you write your resume for industry? So again, sort of like not overemphasizing the research side of things and more emphasizing the softer skills. How do you do that?
Okay. All right. And my best recommendation is when you're writing your resume, schedule an appointment with me.
Go see Brad.
All right. That is one of the things that I talk about. Okay. And one of the things there's several areas that you can do that in on your resume. One is if you look at skills, list your team skills, list your management skills. Have you mentored a post-bac? Have you led an initiative? So emphasize those kinds of things in your skills section. The other thing, and this is the most important thing you can think of when you're writing your resume, is just don't focus on your experience, but focus on your accomplishments. What have you done? Why is this research important? What do we know now that we didn't know before, right? And I should emphasize that in general, the accomplishment is not necessarily the publication. The accomplishment for industry may be what is the subject matter of that publication and why is it important?
I'm putting a link into the chat as well. of another talk that Brad gives, that has advice on how to write your resume for industry positions specifically. So if you've not seen that talk before, I recommend going to our YouTube channel and watching that one. What key qualities do you think make someone successful in a C-suite role in biotech?
You know, the C-suite in biotech, and I would say it's very similar to the C-suite in other industries as well. And it's really about problem solving and getting things done through people.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, you gotta show that successes of getting projects done with groups of people.
Yeah.
So really working your way up through the company. Is LinkedIn really the best way to apply for jobs in an industry?
You know, LinkedIn is a pretty good way to do it. I think there are better ones for this industry. And that is, I like, and by the way, I said LinkedIn is pretty good. I recommend the bio websites. So the biotech innovation organization, they have local organizations, particularly in the large biotech areas. And so North Carolina, Maryland, Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey, Boston, San Diego, LA, Orange County, Bay Area, and Seattle. Just type bio in those areas. And those are specific for bio jobs and in those particular areas. Here in Maryland, we have several sources. The Maryland Department of Commerce website has a searchable database of every biotech company in the state. And that is about 2,700 of them. It also has a very good job board in there for those companies as well.
Follow-up question to that, specific examples of good places to look for smaller startup companies, in both bio and the Maryland Department of Commerce.
Those sources are the best. I mean, here in Maryland, we know AstraZeneca, we know GSK, but there are 2,698 companies that we may not know about. And those sources are the best for those. And those also include, networking opportunities, and other opportunities where you may have the opportunity to interact with people in companies.
Yeah, absolutely.